Hello, and welcome back as we look at another question that Jesus asked in the book of John. I'm going to start off by asking you a few questions. Here it goes. If you could sum up in one sentence what you believe, what would you say? If you could boil it all down to the bare bones of the essence of what you believe, what is it that would be left? In other words, what is at the heart of the gospel that you believe? Well, there are some people say that question is answered in the book of John, especially in chapter 8, and that's where we're going to look today. It's a famous story, and it's really kind of hard for me to imagine what it would be like if this story were not contained in this gospel. Yet there are many scholars who believe that it wasn't there originally. If you have a study Bible and it has some notes about it, it may tell you some things along that line. It may say that scholars believe that John did not write John chapter 8, 1 through 11. And the reason for that is because there are some both literary and also thematic differences. That in these 11 chapters, the writer uses words that John doesn't use in the rest of his gospel anywhere. Also, there's some conflict here at the temple between Jesus and the leadership. We don't typically find that here in the book of John. We might find it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but not here. Also, those notes will also tell you that in all of the other early manuscripts, that means those earliest and oldest editions of the Gospel of John that are circulating or that we have, this story is not there. So it really skips over from at the end of chapter 7, and then it jumps to chapter 8, verse 12. And so this story is not included in those early and ancient manuscripts. In fact, there are many commentaries, and I have a Broadman commentary, which is sort of a classic Baptist commentary, and it skips over this completely. It doesn't even address this part of the Gospel of John at all. So let's read that story and see what we would have missed if this story had not been here. I'm going to start with verse 1. As dawn appeared again, he was in the temple courts where all of the people had gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in the very act of adultery. They made her stand before the group, and they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what is it that you say?" They were using the question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and he said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard this began to go away at that time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has anyone accused you?" "No one, sir," he said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." And so the scene opens at the temple where Jesus is teaching. There's a lot of irony here. Part of that is that it was the temple where people went to find forgiveness. And to do so, they would take a sacrifice, offer that sacrifice before the priest, and then God would forgive them. And so now here the scribes and the Pharisees, some of the religious leaders, come to Jesus. They drag this woman before him. She stands there before him. And while the writer doesn't give us much of a background on this, I can imagine she's standing there terrified, trembling, sobbing, embarrassed, with her hands in front of her face trying to hide from the people who are there. This is not a trial by her peers. No, in fact, it is a group of men who she's standing before, men who have already made up their mind about whether or not she was innocent or guilty, men who have decided her fate. Then in verse 4 comes the accusation. "Teacher," they say, "this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law of Moses, he commanded that we stone her. What do you have to say about this?" They were pretty confident that they had Jesus either way. If Jesus agreed and said, she needs to be stoned, then the Romans would jump all over him because he was advocating murder. Or if he said, don't stone her, then they could accuse him of things like heresy, not believing the law. So they felt pretty confident that either way, the trap had worked. Now, what we don't understand always is that there are some irregularities in this case in the way they presented it. One, there are no witnesses at all that said that she had really been caught in what they say, the very act of adultery. Deuteronomy 17:6 says, on the testimony of 2 or 3 persons, a person is to be put to death, but no one is to be put to death on the testimony of 1 person. That same wording is sort of expanded on or repeated again in chapter 19, verse 7. Chapter 9, verse 15, One witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of a crime or offense that they may have committed. The matter must be established by a testimony of 2 to 3 witnesses. So therefore, Jesus was not provided with enough information to be able to make an informed decision about what was happening here. The scribes and the Pharisees also talk as if the law only required that the woman who was in that adulterous relationship would be the one who would be put to death. In fact, they said such woman, they described her in verse 5 as such women as this. They completely ignore the fate of the man. But the Mosaic law said that both the man and the woman would stand under the penalty. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22 says, if a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. Or in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, it says, if a man commits adultery with another man's wife, he has dishonored his father. Both the man and the woman are to be put to death, and their blood will be on their hands. So these irregularities, I'll call them, make it clear that the leaders aren't really concerned with what the Mosaic law has to say. Instead, their main concern is that they want to set a trap for Jesus. Now, Jesus' response comes in 2 balanced parts, and in both parts, he makes a response. The first one is a nonverbal response. He bends down and he writes on the ground. The second one is a verbal response. Straightening up to speak, it says, and then he speaks verbally. Now, no one knows what Jesus wrote when he wrote on the ground. There's a lot of speculation, and many have tried to figure out what it was, but we don't know. What is important is the very act itself, the act of writing. In the ancient world, if you were talking to someone and they stopped and they started writing on the ground, it was an acceptable or recognized act, basically, saying that they were refusing to listen and they were disengaging themselves from the conversation. That's why the religious leaders kept pressing Jesus with their questions, because they knew that this was an act of disengaging and an act of refusal. But they kept pressing and pressing because they wanted to see what Jesus had to say. It really wasn't until he straightened up and he knelt down again that they really took it seriously and they began to walk away. But Jesus straightened up and he doesn't answer the question that they ask. Instead, he moves beyond this legal argument of what they have brought before him to what Jesus believes is the greater issue, and that is the issue of sin. He says, let the one who is without sin throw the first stone. Something important about sin. With it comes some accountability. Jesus knew this. Jesus understood this. Here were leaders who wanted to hold the woman accountable. They hadn't counted on the fact that Jesus would also hold them accountable to their past actions, accountable to their relationship with the law, which they had been willing to distort in order to press this case against Jesus. So when Jesus does bend down again and he begins writing on the ground again, he is communicating to them that he has nothing left to say to them. He's through with this conversation. And so, starting with the oldest, moving to the youngest, they begin to drop their stones one at a time. And this leaving indicates that even the most senior of the group, the most revered members of this group, are truly people also without sin. People who also have sin in their lives as well. And so now Jesus stands before the woman. You have to wonder, is she thinking, what is it that he's going to do? Is he going to be as cruel and mean as these other men who brought her to stand out and humiliated her in public? Up until this point, this woman had had one role, and that is that she was a pawn in this trap to get Jesus. She had been used. But Jesus doesn't do what the other men had done. Instead, he treats her with respect, and he treats her as an equal. And he asks the question that we come to look at today, and that is, where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you? And as she looked around, there really was no one left to condemn her. Now, she was still accountable for her choices. She had to face face her sin, and she had to do so face to face. She couldn't blame it on anyone else. She couldn't blame her sin on the man or on her parents or the limited background that she had experienced or the world in which she lived in. No, she was responsible. And like the leaders, she was forced to look at the kind of life that she had lived and the choices that she had made. Now, Jesus didn't brush aside those consequences. He didn't brush aside what she had done and say that none of it was important, because it was. But to both the leaders and the woman, Jesus offered them this great opportunity that they could break free from the old ways where power and condemnation and death were so powerful. And they could enter into a new world that was filled or marked with freedom and also with forgiveness. You see, the leaders had an opportunity. They could walk away too. They could be forgiven. They had an opportunity to leave a life that was filled with judgment and control and pride that characterized them. And the woman had an opportunity to leave this past behind and to become a new person and to have a new future before her. See, I believe this story is more than just a story about sexual sin or about the self-righteousness of a group of leaders. It's a story about the authority that Jesus has to bring new life. Remember where this took place? At the temple. The temple was the place where people came to find forgiveness. And the way they found that forgiveness was by bringing a sacrifice. But here in that place where people came to find forgiveness through an institution, Jesus offered it to them, and he didn't require them to make a sacrifice at all. Where does this authority come from? Well, it comes from God. And so Jesus asked this question to the woman. Woman, where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you? And then those beautiful words, neither do I condemn you. But you need to leave, walk away, and make the decision that you're not going to sin anymore. He doesn't condemn her. He takes her seriously. And he looks her in the eyes and he sees someone who he sees more than sin. He sees more than disgrace. He sees more than the wasted years that she's had. He sees a woman who has potential that she has never known in her life or never seen it herself. You see, Jesus understood all of the twisting and winding roads that had led her to this very terrible hour. And he was able to look through all of that and to see her and to love her. Now, sadly, the Pharisees and the scribes, they failed to find forgiveness on that day because they were unwilling or unable to face their own greed or their own self-righteousness or the wrong choices that they had made. And they walked away empty. There's another lesson in this story, and that is that whenever we experience forgiveness ourselves or whether we extend it to someone else, we're always at that junction where we are standing face to face with the future without all of the weight of the past upon us. You see, the Pharisees wanted to stone her. They wanted to make her suffer for her actions. To them, there was nothing other than that. No way she could redeem herself. Except for Jesus, who released her from that heavy burden of her past, and he showed her a brand new door that was open toward her future. And so the question that comes to her comes to us as well. Where are your accusers? I don't condemn you either. Go and sin no more. Now, the burden was now on her shoulders. What would she do? She could let all of the past fall away and that burden be removed from her life, or she could carry it with her for the rest of her days. Unfortunately, John does not tell us how this story ends. Now, we would like to think that she left that place a changed woman. In fact, we teach when we preach that she was. But it really doesn't tell us what her decision was. We don't know. And so we have to live with that, because it really could go either way, just like it goes either way with us. So the question for us to think about today is, where are your accusers? Where is the sin that accuses you? And what can be done with it? The good news is it can be removed. And a new future can also be yours in Jesus Christ. Isn't that a great gift?